Hello, at long last, here is a video lecture, Lecture 2, Poverty, which will also include a discussion of economic inequality in the United States. Poverty, obviously, is a form of economic inequality. There's not as much discussion of economic inequality in general in our social problems textbook, or really in most, but because for those of us who are beyond getting by, the fact that maybe relative to others, our income is pretty much stuck in the same spot over time does not seem the same sort of a social problem as some of the others we discuss, but it certainly is related to others. It's a contributing factor. So I'm going to cover some of that as well. Let me say I would like you to read, at the very least, section 2.2 of chapter 2 in our textbook. Chapter 2 is on poverty. Section 2.2, there some commonly held beliefs that are myths are dispelled there, and this may be one of the few cases where I do put a question on the exam that relates to something in the textbook that I do not mention today. Similarly, I want to say that I may say something in this lecture that is not in that PDF. From time to time, I will include a question that may not be in the PDF on the exam. So you need to watch these lectures carefully. So having said that, let me share my screen. We'll get going with this. I've been spending a lot of time searching for the most up-to-date information I can find. We are on the cusp of completely new trends in a lot of this data, given the effects of the pandemic and the economic effects of the shutdown, et cetera, and what's likely to continue in the future being nothing like the world as it was before January 1, for instance. A lot of the trends that you will see on these graphs are going to go a different direction next time there's updated data. Some of you may, like me, be getting random phone call, not random, but may have gotten a phone call from an automated system with the Census Bureau or an email asking you to provide some information. They are tracking the economic impact of the pandemic on households. They will ask a series of questions about how confident are you can make your house or rent payment? How confident are you that you will be able to afford enough food? Those sorts of things. So data is being gathered. A lot of it just hasn't been compiled and released yet. I have a little bit of that. But as I say, updating from what I had to try to get as close to the present moment has been a challenge. So please excuse the warts in my PDF. And I hope, by the way, I should say, if you haven't watched part 3 of lecture 1, where I discuss how to interpret graphs, it would be a good idea to do that before you start this. There are a lot of graphs in here. So let's move on. Poverty, we probably all have a good idea of what that means. It's basically not having enough of what one needs, or in some cases, what you believe you need in order to live the kind of life you want to lead. Just a moment, I'm sharing the screen. There we go. You can distinguish between absolute and relative poverty. It's believed that for a long time poverty was not really, it was sort of invisible in the United States because there was not that distinction. For instance, during the Depression of the 1930s, if you were a farmer, you might have had enough to eat, and you might have been able to get to provide most of what you needed in your life somehow yourself or with the assistance of friends and neighbors. If you lived in a city, you had different problems. You were unlikely to have a place to grow food, for instance, or the skills to grow food successfully. For instance, my grandparents and my mother, for instance, who grew up on a farm during the 1930s, did not really think they were poor because they had a lot of food. They had cattle, they had a dairy farm, they grew a huge garden. My grandfather could, he built the house they lived in, he repaired the equipment that he had. He was not dependent upon having to come up with money to pay for very much. So in an absolute sense, they were not poor. In a relative sense, they might have been, because they did not have as much cash income, perhaps, as someone in a city or elsewhere. So relative poverty, absolute. But anyway, let's just move on. I will tarry with these declarations. Really, what we're talking about in a broad sense, abstractly, is something called social class, social stratification, socioeconomic stratification, which is just a hierarchical layering of people based upon how much of a particular resource they have. That resource by which people are measured and judged varies over time across cultures. In capitalist society, that resource is money. So stratification. Oops, wrong one. It's just a way of dividing society into different layers. Now, the term stratification, strata, comes from geology. If you've been to a part of the country where there's actual topography, hills and so forth, been on a road trip, you may have been on an area where the highway cut through a hill or something, and you noticed light rocks in layers, different colored layers. Those are called strata. So it comes, I believe it's a Latin term, and a lot of Latin and Greek terms end up in these academic nomenclature. Stratification is what sociologists use to describe this ordering of different groups on the basis of how much of something or other they have. So it's multidimensional. So usually, as I said, it's based on income and wealth in this society and most Western societies, just about most societies in the world at this point. People with similar income and wealth, now income and wealth are different. Income is the amount of money you get from work, or the flow of money from investments you make if you are independently wealthy, for instance. Wealth is how much you've managed to accumulate. So that can be the value of your house and the raw value, the market value of your stocks and bonds, how much is in your savings account, all those things. So there have been different ways to define who's in what social class, what they are. Karl Marx, the founder of conflict theory, although he wasn't aware that's what he was founding at the time, he basically said what class you're in depends upon whether or not you own the means of production or you sell your labor to the people that own the means of production. What is the means of production? Well, that's a factory, for instance, a mine, a large industrial concern, basically. He called the upper class the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie, sometimes called the capitalist class, the lower class, the working class, he called the proletariat. That's proletariat's from Latin and bourgeoisie is from French. So there's also sometimes a gradational approach instead of relational, where you just use, for instance, the numeric income to assign cut points in the overall structure of household incomes. And that's where you get terms like lower middle class, upper middle class, so forth, where you start defining them just based upon some other scheme than ownership of means of production or not. So We haven't, I discussed Marx briefly in lecture one. He's important because he was the first theorist to use class to try to understand what went on in the social world, particularly the history of social organizations. And although he wrote about these two classes, and when he wrote about other periods of history, there was two different classes, he knew that there were more than that, but he considered history to be driven by class conflict between two classes, what he called world historical classes. They were the ones who were the players. There were others around, but they were not specific to any particular class formation or organization of society. So Max Weber, a famous sociologist who probably gave us more of sociological nomenclature and concepts that are still in use than any of the other classical social theorists. He had a more complex system. He defined your position in the class structure as not only your income and wealth, but also cultural factors, your education, your religion, what it is you like to do with your leisure time, as well as your relationship to the power structure, to the government, to politics. Okay, so what sociologists have found that you look at these three dimensions, and people who rank high on some basis, and I don't want to make any normative claims when I say somebody is higher in some scale than another to say that that's better in any way. It's just how people are divided, so it can be changes, trends can be measured and so forth, and a group life can be understood. But anyway, if you rank high, if you're very wealthy, odds are high you're going to have high social status, and you may also have a lot of connections with the political elite. This is something called status crystallization. And people tend to associate with those who are like themselves on these three dimensions for the most part. So, I mean, not exclusively, of course. For instance, I don't get invited to parties in River Oaks by Harvard attorneys. I'm not one of those folks. So anyway, so here's some of this you don't need to worry about. It's taken from another course, but Weber also gave us the term life chances, so like the odds of getting what it is you value out of life. And that is closely connected with where you rank in this matrix of ordering of people, class, status, and party politics, he called it. Where you are, it has a big impact on your life chances. Are you going to get what it is that you've come to value through your education, indoctrination, whatever it may be. In a capitalist society, that's usually material prosperity. So where you start also tends to be, for most people, the class you start off in, the one you're born into, is you're not going to move that far up the class ladder, despite the American ideology that this is a meritocracy where if you work hard enough and you're talented, the sky's the limit. Everybody can be president, so to speak. Well, there are no institutional legal barriers for anyone, if they live to age 35, becoming president, but in reality, the world works a little differently. So moving on, another factor in terms of the reproduction of social class is this cultural sphere. Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, anthropologist who passed recently, introduced a concept called cultural capital. Now, capital we often think of as money. For Marx, it's not really money, it's more of a social relation, but we can call it something as money, for instance, that's good enough. Cultural capital is your knowledge of certain cultural products and activities. that act as class markers. For instance, if you only listen to opera and classical music and so forth, and well, let me back up a second. Different socioeconomic groups have different tastes in music and art and all these things. And apart from whatever reason they may have developed that, it tends to be a signal to others of your class status. For instance, if you go to the Houston Opera, you're going to see a different group of people demographically there than you would at other kinds of musical performances. You're going to see a wider, more affluent, probably older group that are going to the opera on a regular basis compared to those who would go to pop concerts, for instance. The same is true of art. The upper classes, so to speak, are more likely to know about and have some idea, or at least have absorbed some idea of how to understand some of the abstract artworks you might see at the Houston Museum of Art, the installations, whereas many others would be drawn more towards just landscape, something which is very representational as opposed to abstract. Bourdieu wrote a famous book, very lengthy book called Distinction, about this and the importance of, or the role of, cultural factors in reproducing the class structure of society. There are also various class markers that you learn as a child that are associated with just dining, just eating, for instance. There are cases where you may be in a very formal dinner party setting of some sort where you have multiple forks and spoons, and they are intended to be used with specific types of food. And you learn what goes with what from your parents if you are growing up in an upper middle class or upper class household. You just learn it. Similarly, you may learn to appreciate abstract art because you have parents who have the time and the resources. They don't have to be they can take you to a museum. Paying the cost of getting in is not a problem. They have learned through their education or from their parents how to interpret, how to think about some of these things. It's not something people are born with. They have to learn it. And the nature of communication within families, the sorts of activities which the family is going to be engaged in, which the children may come to associate with things you do with your free time, is going to vary by class. So for instance, you go to a job interview and you recognize a piece of art on the wall or a reproduction, or you know that it's similar to another famous artist, and you mention it, and whoever's interviewing you, let's say, this is a case where it's a small firm and the owner of the firm is interviewing you, and she has a reproduction of the Picasso painting, and you recognize it and can say something about it. You have just told her that you are one of her people. So, and people often in a position to hire others, often they will hire people that are much like themselves and reproduce whatever systematic inequities that the social organization at the time may produce. So anyway, that's Bourdieu. Cultural capital. You can convert it into money, in other words. It's convertible. There's a term, symbolic capital, that he used, and that is that's important in class relations too, because if you have symbolic capital, that sends a signal that you are entitled to your privilege, to your advantages. Your position in the pecking order, usually a higher one, is legitimate. People, that's so that's something others give you, this symbolic capital. So Okay, economic inequality. Start moving down towards poverty. Economic inequality has been increasing in the United States and many countries since the 1970s. There are several explanations that have been proposed for that. You may, if you were born after 1980, you probably remember the Occupy Wall Street movement when there was a lot of discussion about economic inequality and the fact that many people's income was stuck in one spot or was declining over time. There was another very small group of elites whose income was increasing. No matter what happened to the broader economy, somehow their income and wealth was always going up. There was a slogan that came out of that, "We are the 99%," where they differentiated between the 1% with at the highest level of income and wealth and the 99%, which was everyone else. So what is this 1% now? I see a typo in my my presentation here that says 1%. It should be 1. I will fix that soon. In fact, I will fix it now or I will forget. So pardon my all right, top 1%. What that means is you can call it the 99th percentile, which means 99% of whatever. If you've taken a standardized test, you may have got a percentile associated with a particular score. If you're at the 99th percentile, that means 99% of whoever. So let's say people taking the standardized test had a lower score. In other words, you are in the 1% on that case. So 1%. How much money do you need to make? Well, in 2018, it was $427,000 a year. It's after-tax income for a household. Okay. You get to that point, 99% of American households bring in less than $427,000 per year. It's interesting to note that once you get the average of that group, though, is 1.32 million, because that includes what you can call the 0.1% or the 0.01%. And the more you slice it into these smaller, further and further up, you will see differences in how much their income has increased over time. All of the increase in income in the past 30 years has gone to the 1%, and a big chunk of that, the largest chunk of that has gone to the 0.1%. And the 0.01%, which aren't many families at all, more than you might think. I don't have the number. I used to have it on the top of my head. I apologize. So they have done very well. We'll see a little in the graph here in a moment. We should see that. So 1979, the top 1%, this group, earned about 10% of all the income earned in the United States, but in 2018, it was a little over 20%. Another way to look at inequality is how the ratio between the CEO of a company and the median income of an employee at that company, how much has that changed? Okay, so you get the median income of everyone that works there, and then the one income of the top person. What is the ratio of that? How many times more than the median income does the CEO make? In 1983, that ratio was 46-1. In a study that was done in 2013, it was 330-1. In 2011, the CEO of Apple made 6,000 times the salary of the average worker. But the grand prize goes to Elon Musk of Tesla. Just recently, it was in 2019 reported, his income is about 41,000 times that of a median worker at his company. That's a big gap. That's not, that is huge. That is huge. That's, Anyway, so Occupy Wall Street, I mentioned already. Here's a couple of videos you can look at if you like. Some of these statistics came from this report by the Economic Policy Institute. If you really want to go into this, take a look at this. However, I pulled the number from this, which was allegedly from there. So why has economic inequality increased? Well, Thomas Piketty, a French economist, wrote a very large book called Capital in the 21st Century. Amazon said it was their least read bestseller ever. Well, how could they know that? Well, if you buy the Kindle version of a book on Amazon and you make highlights, you make a note here somewhere, Amazon stores that information. They know exactly how far over on average people have read, or you in particular. They know what you've chosen to highlight, what was important. They have that. You give them that information when you buy, you agree to give that information to them when you buy your Kindle book, which is why I was suspicious when all of my highlights disappeared from a book that was very critical of Amazon that I had on Kindle. It eventually came back, but it was odd. So anyway, Thomas, they were able to determine that people didn't get very far in Piketty's book. There could be, you know, as I say, if you can still see this book, I mean, if you can still see my screen, you can see it is a fat book, and it is full of economic statistics, graphs, charts. I think most people stop taking notes at like page 13, according to Amazon. So that's why I say they called it their least read bestseller. And it's basically about inequality for the most part. And he was able to get tax records, from French tax records and some other tax records. Those tend to be hard to get, but he found a lot of historical sources for tracking wealth in France and in Europe in general. And his theory is to, and he documented this increase in inequality in Europe as later in another book, went more deeply into it in the United States case. But basically, he believes that the amount of earnings that might come from investments, interest on money you'd loaned or stock you'd own, the dividends, that has increased faster than the return from work, from labor. Wages have not gone up as fast as investment income. And since you need money to make investments over and above what you need to meet your basic survival needs, it tends to be those with surplus income that have money to invest. So, and this tends to build up in the form of wealth. There have been people earning interest or making money by loaning money since time immemorial. And that's a solid business. People are always going to be have a need to borrow for whatever reason. However, the what some call the real economy, where you have to sell your labor to someone in exchange for wages, there's a lot of variability in that. There are recessions and depressions even. We are in a recession right now. It could deepen to what's called a depression. The economists distinguish between the two on a basis that I can't quite recall. But it's basically how many quarters of negative economic growth in a row does one have. So anyway, so Piketty, he said it returns for investment increase faster than the increases in wages. And we have seen wages fall for a lot of reasons. Deindustrialization, where jobs have gone overseas, the industrial heartland of the United States, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, factories shut down. The Rust Belt is the term for areas of that part of the country because factories are literally rusting. Technological change is related to that. There's more works being done through automation or assistance to human labor provided by some sort of high-tech machinery. That's been a big factor in the loss of jobs in the coal industry. one person can now produce more coal using the technology that's available than used to be the case in the past. You also have political factors. That is a big one. Since really the Reagan era, tax in the 1980s, taxes have been cut periodically by each successive administration, except perhaps the Obama administration and the Carter administration. Well, the Carter was before Reagan, so never mind that. It's a popular campaign promise. I'll cut your taxes. Most people don't really like to pay taxes, but taxes are the price we pay to live in a civilized community to the extent this is. I mean, granted, a lot of the taxes we pay are for activities that are far from what one might call civilized, but we need to keep the roads maintained, keep the wastewater treatment plants working, and all of the pipelines underneath the streets intact. In the city of Houston, we are going to be paying much higher water bills because we've allowed the infrastructure of the city to start falling apart beneath our feet because it was more popular to use the money for something else, and the state has limited the amount of property taxes that a city or a county can collect just to maintain roads, bridges, infrastructure. That has been done systematically. Tax cuts, as they have operated in the United States since 1980, they tend to give more of a cut to those who pay more taxes, which are the wealthiest. There's been, as a result, there's been less money for a lot of the activities that the federal government had been providing some support for. For instance, education. The amount of money that's been provided to public education, particularly college education, has, from all levels of government, has decreased over the past 20 years, and students have had to pay a higher share of the cost of education, which has also gone up. Often too many students, and I've done this as well, pay for that by taking out a loan, and then one ends up in debt. Right now there's about 1.6 trillion in student loan debt outstanding at this point, and you can expect in the next 6 months to see the amount of that is in default that's not being paid increase. Student loan debt is unlike other debt because you cannot discharge it through bankruptcy except in very, very rare and difficult to prove circumstances. So that's going to function as a drag on economic growth for some time. That's why I mentioned inequality and this whole bundle of political decisions that have increased it as really behind several social problems. So, okay, so in addition to tax cuts and changing tax policies to favor income earned from investment as opposed to work, had cuts to the benefit programs for the poor. Bill Clinton bragged that he had ended welfare as we know it. Welfare is a catch-all term for public assistance to the poor. Some programs that had been around since the 1960s were rebranded, let's say. They were changed. Work requirements were put on some of these programs. AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, was replaced by something called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. AFDC was not necessarily temporary. TANF is. You can draw it for a certain amount of time, and then you have to either get into a job training program or a job. And I don't know. I'm not a social worker. I don't know all the details of eligibility requirements. Food stamps was something which it wasn't all that hard to get, and if you needed them. The replacement, the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, the current administration has been trying to cut that every year, and it's had some success. since they took office in 2016. So, and really, in a way, what we're talking about here is the advent of something called neoliberalism. And this is a global thing. This is a political economic philosophy which basically holds that government intervention in the economy is a bad thing. Markets are always right. If wages are low, let's say the minimum wage is too low at $7.25 an hour right now, neoliberal thinking would say, well, you should not have a minimum wage at all. You should let the market determine what the wages are going to be. So it could go lower. But additionally, more importantly, this is how it became global. Often in order to qualify for some sort of assistance from one country to another, or from an international economic aid organization like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, you might have to agree to change your social support system, the safety net, to make it less generous. Or you might have to open your economy up to more investment from outside. It's called neoliberalism because the classical liberalism involved free trade and some government activity. I have to pause this for just 1 second, just one moment here. And I can't do that unless I stop the sharing.